So I am really excited to read you today Dr. Yuri Miyamoto's work on cultural and the physical environment, which the title seems a little kind of just open ended, like, what? Okay. Um, this paper shows, the previous papers have showed that if we use the language of a culture, we begin to think ideas of that culture, right? It's like we perpetuate those thought processes. They actually become activated without us even really thinking about it. So we take in the language because we want to communicate with others, and then our mind gets indoctrinated. This one's showing basically the same thing, except with the built environment. Also, full disclosure, me and Yuri are friends. Um, Friends might be a little strong, but Yuri was on my dissertation defense committee, has one of the members of my dissertation committee. So really got to know her pretty well over the course of my 7 years in grad school, and she's a really cool lady. So and then she worked with Dick Nisbet and Takahiko Masuda, and they're super famous in the field of cultural psychology, and so is Yuri. And this study right here, I think, is really fantastic. Um, we both published our papers, and this is a paper in Psych Science, near the same time, and they came out kind of close together, and so like she gave me a nod in grad school for hitting up a Psych Science paper, and I was like, your paper's at least first author and way better. And this is, I mean, it's just an absolute treat to read this paper because you're getting to see with the articles that I chose, like how the world culture really impacts us in our minds. So let's get into this one. Westerners' perceptions tend to focus on salient foreground objects. We focus on salient foreground objects. That means things that are noticeable in the front, in the center, in that sort of area, in the place that we would consider to be the place to look. Now, whereas Asians are more inclined to focus on context. So, focal object versus focal object in relation to others. We hypothesize that such culturally specific patterns of attention may be afforded by the perceptual environments of each culture. Okay, we hypothesized that these patterns may be caused by what people see in each culture. In order to test this hypothesis, we randomly sampled pictures of scenes from small, medium, and large cities in Japan and the United States. Okay, they got pictures. What are they going to do with them? Using both subjective and objective measures, study one demonstrated that Japanese scenes were more ambiguous and contained more elements than American scenes. Okay, these environments differ. Japanese scenes thus may encourage perception of the context more than American scenes. Wait. So they're saying study number one showed that the Japanese environments were more complicated and spread out and not as focal. Japanese scenes thus may encourage perception of the context more than American scenes. Hint, 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 survival, right? You have to survive. In study two, pictures of locations in cities were presented as primes, and participants' subsequent patterns of attention were measured. Both Japanese and American participants primed with Japanese scenes attended more to contextual information than did those primed with American scenes. Whoa. Both Japanese and American participants primed with Japanese scenes attended to more contextual information than those primed with American scenes. Being primed with these environments that were taken from the real world made people think in patterns that we thought were just like individual differences across culture, like cross-cultural patterns. They found that exposure to the environment itself can impact our basic cognition. Basic cognition. Do you focus on the center? Do you focus on the relationship among objects? These results provide evidence that culturally characteristic environments may afford distinctive patterns of perception. Let's phrase this in a Diricky way, right? These studies show that the intelligence is inside our architecture, is inside our gardens, is inside our houses, is inside our schools, is inside every place that shares a common construction. It's in the way we organize our living spaces. It's in the way we organize the way we live, causes us to think in ways that are beneficial to the culture, that help people develop the meaning system of their culture. I think this study is right in line with everything else we've been reading up till this point. Now we get to start. You know, abstracts are great. We know what this study shows. You could tune out, but you're going to miss some good insights. You're free to do what you'd like. I'm free to take a drink of seltzer water, which oddly is becoming this commodity that I wish I had more of. Cultural differences in cognition have been widely documented across various domains. Whereas people of Western culture tend to engage in context-independent cognitive processes and to perceive and think about the environment in an analytical way, people of East Asian culture tend to engage in context-dependent cognitive processes and to perceive and think about the environment in a holistic way. This is going back to individualism and collectivism, independent and interdependent, right? Thinking about one object versus thinking about the relation of one object with many. This is consistent with what we've learned already about people and cognition. It was in that paper as well, right? But in this paper, it's adding that little extra bit. It's saying like, at the basic level, basic cognitive tasks, what you attend to, what you focus on, right, is correlated with the culture you're from. So like if you grew up in American culture, you focus on the object as an individual, as an entity outside of everything else. If you grew up in East Asian culture, Japanese culture in specific, when we get to the study, people focus on the relationships between objects. Okay, I think we get that. In an illustrative study, I'm going to show you an example. Both Japanese and Americans were shown a short video clip depicting an underwater scene with fish, small animals, plants, and rocks, and were asked to report what they saw in the clip. Americans referred mainly to features of focal fish, large, foreground, rapidly moving, bright colored, whereas Japanese referred more to the context and to relationships between focal objects and context, background objects and location of objects in relation to one another. What did they say there? Whoa, that one got there. Whereas Japanese referred more to context and to relationships between focal objects. So they noticed what changed in not the objects in the environment and the environment itself. They noticed relationships between objects in the environment. Okay, like it was, whereas Americans were like, oh, there's a big green fish there, right? The Japanese in these studies were more like, oh, well, there was like in the background, there are these changes, these things, that sort of thing. So such cultural differences in attention were also found in other tasks stripped of sociocultural context, so just other basic cognitive tasks. For example, Kiriyama et al. Presented participants with a square frame in which a line was drawn. Participants were then shown other square frames of various sizes and asked to draw a line that was identical to the first line in either absolute length or ratio to the surrounding frame. Let's hold a second. Absolute length is an independent attribute of the line, right? So it's independent of context. That's a situation Americans should be better at based on what they're saying. Versus the ratio, the relationship between the square and the line, that's something if you're focusing on context. If you're better at that, you'll be better at. And, just reserve it a little bit, like because it is cross-cultural comparisons, they're going to get into stuff that sounds like, you know, a little bit like stereotypes. I'm not, but it's mostly just saying like, look, there are these cross cultural differences. But you also got to understand that this paper bridges that gap between the cross cultural psychology and cultural psychology. This is one of the first papers I read in cultural psychology that converted me, because before I met Yuri, I was kind of like, ugh, this field just kind of talks about stereotypes and how people are different and just seems weird to me. It seems a little racist, right? And then this study in particular won me over. So you'll sort of see why in a second. Kiriyama et al. Found that whereas Americans were more accurate in the absolute task, Japanese were more accurate in the relative task. So absolute is draw the line the same size, relative is draw the ratio. These findings suggest that the Japanese were paying more attention to the frame, context, than Americans were. Although evidence about attentional phenomenon is accumulating, a mechanism underlying cultural differences has not been fully explored. Mechanism is another word for cause. This sentence could be read as, what the hell causes this? We have no idea. In most of the previous cross-cultural studies, I have to move. Cultural differences have been treated mainly as individual differences, which are assumed to be due to socialization. Parents or other individuals may guide children's attention. Sorry, I lost my spot there. Parents or other individuals may guide children's attention in accordance with their own pattern of attention. In addition, Asians' relative greater interdependence or concern with the social world may prompt their greater attention to context. So they're saying, like, well, we know there's a lot of differences across these groups. They've been attributed to individual differences in relationships. That might be the case. However, it gets interesting. In addition to such chronic effects, culture may influence patterns of attention through a more temporary and situational route. For example, using self-construal priming, Kuhner and Oyserman, 2002, demonstrated. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped. For example, using self-construal priming. Oh, yeah. Kuhner and Oyserman adopted self-construal priming, demonstrated that participants who are primed with interdependent self-construal spontaneously encoded contextual information more than those who were primed with independent self-construals. Wait. How do we do that? Yes, you can manipulate independence and interdependence. Think about it this way, right? Like independence, I can make you write about yourself as a unique individual, or I can make you write about how you're connected to others, right? I can do any of those, and I'm going to prime your self-construal to be independent or interdependent. We examine the possibility that cultural differences in the attentional pattern might be directly afforded by cultural differences in the physical environment. On the one hand, if objects are more distinctive and stand out from the background more in American environment than in Japanese environment, living in the American environment may direct one's attention to distinctive and focal objects rather than to backgrounds. On the other hand, if objects are more ambiguous and difficult to distinguish from the background in Japanese environment than in the American environment, living in the Japanese environment may direct one's attention to the whole field rather than to specific objects. Take a step back, go into the stuff we've been talking about. Simply living in an environment can take over your basic cognitive processes. That's what they're arguing. That's why this is so special. Scientists, we don't know how, we're not good at hyping up our own stuff. But this study seems just very basic, seems very matter of fact, but what's it mean? Yuri's dropping a truth bomb on you right now. Boom, it exploded. Just stepping foot in a cultural environment shapes your mind in the moment. That's what her hypothesis is, and we know that's what she found based on her results. There is some evidence supporting this speculation. Previous research has shown that people are sometimes blind to changes occurring in the environment. So have you ever seen those videos where they have they ask you to count the number of passes and a gorilla walks through the middle of it and most people don't see the gorilla? Right? That's pretty freaking hilarious. But also, we literally can miss somebody dressed in a gorilla costume walking through a scene just because we're counting the passes. That's how That's how just mind-boggling the mind is. So they're talking about that research. Um, Especially changes in the periphery or context. Employing this change blindness paradigm, that's what it's called, we presented both Americans and Japanese with several pairs of animated clips of scenery, a farm that differed in various small details. Some of the changes involved the attributes of the focal objects, that is, foreground, rapidly moving objects, and the other changes were made in the field or context, i.e., changes in the attributes or non foreground objects and their movements in relation to one another. Okay, we created a study where we allowed people to notice focal changes or background changes. In general, Americans detected more changes in the focal objects than the Japanese did, whereas Japanese detected more changes in the field of relationships between objects than did Americans did. So relationships versus like context versus focal objects. And what I think is interesting here is that this is a basic attentional process. Where do you put your attention? Where does it exist? These results supported the previous findings on cultural differences in attentional pattern. However, the cultural differences depended on the type of scenery. There were three types of scenery: Japanese scenery, Japanese farmer, Japanese city, American scenery, American farmer, American city, and culturally neutral scenery, construction site, airport, stuff that's present everywhere. Both Japanese and Americans detected more changes in the background when viewing the Japanese scenery than when viewing the American scenery, whereas both detected more changes in the attributes of focal objects when viewing the American scenery than when viewing the Japanese scenery. So this is part of a whole line of research. They're publishing two articles at the same time, which is like awesome. And they have one that shows the previous one that's out in press right now shows that just these different scenery types affect the way people process holistically or analytically. Are they looking at the foreground or are they looking at the focal objects? Or I'm sorry, the context and the background or the foreground and the focal objects. These findings imply that the perceptual environment prompts culturally specific patterns of attention. All of these findings are suggestive. They're in, let's just take a break. Okay, are we all good? I think we're all there. In this task, when they used basic fake Japanese and American scenes, they noticed that the scenes themselves were drawing out patterns of perception. Although these findings are suggestive, their implications are limited because the scenes were artificially created and thus may not have accurately represented the perceptual environments of Japan and the United States. These were fake, false environments in this other study. We need to show this exists for real environments. One aim of the present study was to compare the perceptual environments of Japan and the United States to determine whether Japanese environments are indeed more complex. The second aim was to examine the effect of exposure to those environments. We hypothesized that culturally specific patterns of attention are afforded by the perceptual environments of each culture. The culture you are present in, the environment you are in, it was built around a cultural worldview and then creates basic cognitive processes in your mind. That's the hypothesis they are testing. In study one, we examined cultural differences in the perceptual environment. In study two, we directly tested whether cultural differences in the perceptual environment actually led to different patterns of attention. Specifically, we hypothesized that being exposed to the Japanese perceptual environment makes people attend more to contextual information than does being exposed to the American perceptual environment. Okay. The environment can create thoughts, is the argument here, just like the language can create thoughts. Basic thoughts. Both studies, basic thoughts. Sampling scenery. In order to sample equivalent perceptual environments across the two cultures, we randomly sampled three types of institutions: hotels, public elementary schools, and post offices. Three places that if you go to and take pictures, at least back in the early 2000s, you're not going to raise too many eyebrows. These are everyday scenery. Each type of institution was sampled in small, medium, and large cities in both countries. Why would they do that? Well, cities are more cram packed. Maybe the difference only exists in cities. Maybe it only exists in rural communities. Who knows? We took digital pictures at each selected location. There was a time when those of us remember using non digital pictures with films. Cities, cities equivalent in population and land were chosen from Japan and the United States as shown in Table 1. The population and land area were about the same for the two cities of each size. So they show, look at this, they're showing us these nice little, I was trying to get my cursor on there, population, different cities, population, land size, number of elementary schools, number of post offices, number of hotels. Same thing here, population, two medium sized cities, land area, elementary schools, post offices, hotels. Small cities, population, land area, elementary schools, post offices, and hotels. The large cities were New York and Tokyo. The medium cities were Ann Arbor and Hikone in the Shinga province. Oh, prefecture, sorry. Which are official sister cities with similar demographic properties. Each has a large university and is located in the middle of the nation near a large lake. The small cities were Chelsea, Michigan, and Thorheim in the Shinga prefecture, whose economies are based primarily on farming. These two cities are located near Ann Arbor and Hikone, respectively. So, they're Yuri went to school in Ann Arbor, did her research around Ann Arbor. It makes sense. Locations. As shown in Table 1, the number of public elementary schools is basically equivalent between matched cities, whereas there are about 4 times more post offices in Japan cities than in American cities. For both medium and small cities, the number of hotels was about the same across the two cultures. As for megalopolises, wow, you try to say that word while being recorded. It was impossible to obtain complete lists of hotels and compare them across the cultures. Therefore, we used Frommer's online data and also consulted other online sources to search for accommodations in New York City and Tokyo. In order to sample as diverse a group of hotels as possible, we took the rate for a night's stay into account and randomly selected an equal number of hotels from each price range. We randomly selected 14 schools and 14 post offices from the large cities, 8 from the central city, and 6 from the periphery. 4 schools and 4 post offices. They're just telling you where they got their pictures from. It's kind of a boring read. We randomly selected hotels. Okay, I get it. Places, we're good. Pictures. The pictures were taken on a FinePix. Okay, they used a camera. Great. The camera was held at eye level of the first author, who's about 160 centimeters tall. At each location, blah blah blah, pictures were taken. Thus, in total, there were basically 1,000 pictures, 122 locations, 2 places, 4 directions, lots of pictures. At each place, 2 of the pictures were taken by looking across the street. One was taken facing the building, and the other was taken facing outward from the building. When there was a sidewalk, the picture was taken from the curb of the sidewalk. If there was no sidewalk, the picture was taken from the edge of the street in order to capture as much sights as possible. 2 more pictures were taken by standing parallel to the street. If there was no sidewalk, the photographer stood as close as possible to the center of the street and aimed at the vanishing point of the street. In the small and medium cities, if there was a sidewalk, the pictures were taken by standing at the curb of the sidewalk and aiming the vanishing point of the roadway. However, because of the large amount of parking on streets, the sights from the curb. I mean, look at how detailed this is. A sidewalk were mostly blocked by cars in the large cities. Therefore, in the larger cities, when there was a sidewalk, the pictures were taken by standing in the middle of the sidewalk and aiming at the vanishing point of the sidewalk rather than the roadway. Example pictures are here. So all those details on those pictures. A little sorry I read that all to you, but they took all these different pictures from these different cities. methods participants: 35 American undergraduates, 20 women and 15 men, and 33 East Asian international students, 20 women and 13 men at the University of Michigan, participated in the study to fulfill their requirements for a psychology course. Subjective measures. In total, 4 scales were employed. Participants were asked how ambiguous is the boundary of each object, how many different objects do there seem to be, to what degree do there seem to be parts of the scene that are invisible, and to what degree is the scene either chaotic or organized. So this is just a question asking people's perceptions of the scenery. Half of the pictures were randomly chosen from each location, and an additional 4 pictures were randomly chosen so that the pictures could be evenly blah blah blah. Each participant was randomly assigned to one of those 6 blah blah blah. The pictures were presented in random order, blah blah blah. All good methods. They did good methods, but we don't have to focus there. Um, because the reliability coefficient of the 4 scales was fairly high, ratings on the 4 scales were averaged to compute a complexity ambiguity composite score. And you might be like, hey, wait, why'd they do that? Because all 4 of those questions were asking the same thing. They're asking the same idea. Are these environments complex or are they not? Using the composite score as a dependent variable, fine. We performed analyses on it. The effect of culture was as predicted. I'm skipping the numbers. You don't need to know these. Japanese scenes were judged to be more complex and ambiguous than American scenes. So all of that was just to say they got 1,000 pictures and people judged the American scenes to be less complex than the Japanese scenes. Now, in addition to the main effect of the size of the city, was significant. This effect was further qualified by an interaction, whereas New York was rated more complex and ambiguous than Ann Arbor and Chelsea. Scenes from the Japanese. Oh, wait, let's look at our pictures. What am I doing? I forget. We're in a little I'm not by myself right now. So these are the scenes, right? You can see them for yourself and compare them. When you compare this to this, do you see more objects? When you compare this to this, do you see more objects? When you compare this to this, do you see more objects? Yeah. The other ones, I'm not so sure. When you compare this to this, do you see more objects? Oh, yeah. This to this. Oh, my God. Look at that one. This to this. Yeah, even there, too. Right? Like, that's all fairly interesting, right? Pretty cool. Yeah, cool, super cool. Okay, let me get back. Sorry, I got a little bit off there. Scenes from the 3 Japanese cities were rated equally complex and ambiguous. So when people were looking at the Japanese scenes, they didn't view them as more ambiguous if they were from a bigger city, but if they were viewing the American scenes, they did, which is very interesting. It says like the way Japanese folks pattern their environments is a similar level of complexity across population density. Blah, blah, blah stats. A post hoc comparing large against medium and small cities was significant in the United States, but not in Japan. This result may imply that cultural differences in the perceptual environment are larger in the smaller, more rural areas in the megalopolises. I got it. Nevertheless, even the relatively complex and ambiguous New York scenes were still rated as less complex and ambiguous than the Tokyo scenes were. Finally, there was a significant main effect of ethnicity, perhaps because of their familiarity with complex environments. East Asian participants rated the pictures to be less complex and ambiguous than American participants did overall. So all study one tells us is we have different pictures that people rated as more or less complex. It's not that interesting, but it's setting up to an interesting study in study 2. Study 1B. In this study, all 976 scenes randomly sampled from the perceptual environment of Japan and the United States were analyzed by more objective means, so not people. Objective measures. Another test of the hypothesis that Japanese scenery is more objects than American scenery, we measured the number of bounded particles in each picture Analyses were performed on a Macintosh computer using the public domain NIH image program. Now, what you may not get, it should say it somewhere, but that's the very program that folks used to use to analyze fMRI data, looking for like variation in, because fMRI data is just a bunch of pictures, right? Looking for variation in those pictures with this special machinery that's used to test differences that happen in brain activity due to blood traveling, okay? Urey used the most sensitive tool you could use to analyze a picture at this time. The analyzed particle, okay, use a program, blah, 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 particles, blah, blah, blah. You don't care about that. We're good. It's, whatever. Processing beforehand, if you want to do this yourself, you can read that. Results. Now, I'm not going to skip this, okay? In order to test our hypotheses, we performed this analysis. I'm going to skip that for you all, both for the blah, blah, blah. In accordance with the results of study one, the main effects of culture were significant for both measures. Pictures of Japanese scenery had much larger number of objects than pictures of American scenery. In addition, the main effects of the size of the city were significant both with the minimum particle size was 50 pixels and when the minimum particle size was 100 pixels. Don't worry about it. It's no big deal. Larger cities were found to have a larger number of objects than medium and small cities. A post-hoc contrast comparing large against medium and small cities was significant. No big deal. What we know is there are more particles in larger cities. There are more particles in Japanese environments than in American environments. Now let's get to study two. In study one, we examined how the cultural differences in the perceptual environment found in study one might afford culturally specific patterns of attention. So all that means there, it said might afford. All they found was that maybe it's the number of objects one's exposed to that causes one to focus on these different patterns of attention. Employing a procedural priming technique, you can read about that if you want, we presented participants with either American or Japanese scenes to evaluate and then asked them to perform a change blindness task with different pictures. Now, what's a change blindness task? Now, a change blindness task, let's see if we can find one. See if we can find, you can find pictures. I want to see if we can find, okay, I'll just go back. We'll just look at the pictures, right? Basically, a change blindness task is exactly all these fun things. Find all the differences here. You ever do highlights as a kid? Yeah, it's everything like that. Like, what's different between these two pictures? Find all the differences here. Find all the differences here, right? And you got focal and background objects in a lot of these, and that's essentially all it is. Let's get back to the article real quick. We hypothesize that being exposed to the Japanese perceptual environment makes people attend more to contextual information than those being exposed to the American perceptual environment. The article's a little repetitive, but that's how we work in science. So I get it, I'm feeling it, but we're getting to the exciting part. You had participants, both American and Americans at Michigan University and Japanese students at Kyoto University in Japan participated in the experiment. From the massive amount of pictures that they used in study one, you can read the methods for how they got from 1,000 to 500. I skipped some of those just because they were kind of boring. We selected those taken parallel to the street because judgments of complexity for these pictures correlated well with objective measures. In addition, all the pictures taken in the medium cities were eliminated in order to avoid possible effects of familiarity among the students of the universities, right? So, boom. Measure of attentional pattern. In order to measure participants' patterns of attention, we used the change blindness task from our previous study. We employed 2 pairs of culturally neutral vignettes, construction and airport. Each vignette included 3 or 4 foreground focal objects and several background objects. The two scenes in each pair differed in the attributes of some focal objects, e.g., a person was or was not shown in the salient truck, and in a contextual information, e.g., the location of the truck, the height of a pole. Each vignette lasted for 20 seconds. Participants were presented with a pair of vignettes in sequence and asked to detect changes between the first and the second. This is literally the scientific use of highlights in a paper. Okay? So what they're going to do is they're going to show people pictures of the cultures. They're going to measure basic cognition. Does the culture you enter impact, directly change your basic cognitive focus after a simple exposure? Participants told they were studying visual image processing and that they would participate in two studies, one using still pictures and the other using animated images. The first part of the study was introduced as a pretest to decide which pictures would be used in a main experiment that was allegedly planned for the next term. Participants were randomly assigned to see 95 Japanese or American scenes. So what they did there first is they lied to them about the point of the experiment, because if they know the point, then your data are corrupt. So you have to make a believable cover story. That was theirs. Participants were then randomly assigned to take a virtual vacation to see 95 Japanese or American scenes and were asked to imagine that they were placed in the scenery and to judge how much they liked the scenery using a 5-point rating scale. So they were told this cover story. They engaged in that cover story. It didn't matter what. All that was happening was they were looking at the scenes in depthly, right? At a high level. They were focusing on them. Participants were then given the unrelated change blindness task. They were told to detect and write down the changes between the two versions of each animated vignette and were given 4 trials to view each pair. So let's go on a virtual vacation and let's see if these impacts your basic cognition. And you got to understand why this is important, right? This is going against everything most people believe. Your environment can impact the way you think by just being exposed to it on a computer screen for a very short period of time. Results table 2. Let's look at table 2. Let's see what we see here. So we have standard deviations are in parentheses. We have means and standard deviations. We have American participants seeing American and Japanese scenes. We see that in both of those scenes, Americans make about 1.66 focal observations. So there's no real difference there. However, in the contextual environment, we see that Americans notice more contextual changes after being exposed to Japanese scenes, a little bit, a 0.6 difference. And if you're looking at those two standard deviations in parentheses there, the average of them is about 1. So this 0.6 difference is about 2/3 of a standard deviation, which is substantial. That's a substantial finding. And I know it's hard to see because, you're looking at the numbers, but one thing we don't know is how many changes were possible. Those are things that we could do more research on that are minute. But ultimately, when you have the standard deviations there, you ask, how many standard deviations are part of these two means? These two means are about 0.6 standard deviations apart. That's a decent size there. For only the contextual group. In the focal group, you don't notice that much of a change. Then you have Japanese participants seeing American scenes, are literally viewing, it looks like, more focal objects than contextual, right? And in the contextual scenes, they're viewing a little bit more, they're more contextual than, after they see Japanese scenes, they're noticing more contextual changes than when they see American scenes. So let's look at this whole pattern here, okay? When Americans are exposed to American and Japanese scenes, they notice about the same number of focal objects. That makes sense. We're hyper-focused to focus on focal objects. However, in the contextual condition, what you notice is that there's more notice of contextual changes after going on the Japanese vacation. Japanese participants showed that when they went on the American vacation, they actually noticed more focal changes. So Japanese participants can be made to act like Americans, and American participants can be made to act like Japanese in terms of the basic cognitive processes that they talk about at the beginning of the paper. Japanese participants also appear to be very impacted by the American and Japanese scenes. When they see Japanese scenes, they're more contextual. When they see American scenes, they are less. So those are the results. Let's see which of these relationships work out. They say I'm not going to read all the complicated analysis. I'm going to skip this. Supporting previous findings of individual differences in patterns of attention, the interaction between culture of participants and type of change was significant. So what they're going to notice there is that American folks are going to notice more focal changes. Japanese folks are going to notice more contextual changes. So they notice that first. That's not necessarily the interesting finding. That's just replicating past research. Because of the previous finding that culture had a main effect only on detection of contextual changes, we conducted a planned contrast testing the effect of participants' culture on detection of contextual changes only. Okay, what's going on there? So, because of their previous work, they only looked at contextual changes. When they did this, they did an analysis that showed that Japanese participants Japanese participants detected a larger number of contextual changes than American participants did, supporting our hypotheses about perceptual affordances. The interaction between culture of prime scenes and type of change was significant. We conducted a planned contrast testing the effect of culture of prime scenes on detection of cultural changes only. Both American and Japanese participants detected a larger number of contextual changes after being primed with Japanese scenes than after being primed with American scenes. Okay, we lost ourselves a little bit there, right? So first things first, let's just go over these tests again. The first test showed that the culture one is from led to different focus in what you were attending to. Then they're saying, okay, this is a little fishy. I'm not going to say it's not, but I'm going to just trust it for right now. But they're saying because of the previous finding that culture had a main effect only on detection of contextual changes, we conducted a planned contrast testing the participants' culture. We conducted a planned contrast testing the effects of participants' culture on detection of cultural changes only. Okay, this isn't fishy at all. This is really good. So what they're saying here is we found this significant ANOVA. We know there's a difference somewhere going on here. And we're only going to do one follow-up test. And that test is going to be based on our past research. So what are they predicting? Japanese participants detected a larger number of contextual changes than American participants did. Boom, we got that. But then the interaction between culture of prime scenes and type of change was significant. Culture of prime scenes and type of change. Not culture of the participant. Culture of the prime scenes interacted with the type of change, focal or contextual, Then they conducted follow-up tests to break down this interaction. Both American and Japanese participants detected a larger number of contextual changes after being primed with Japanese scenes than after being primed with American scenes. So the data didn't work out perfectly, But it worked out pretty interestingly. Both American and Japanese participants were made to think more Japanese like after being exposed to Japanese environments, right? And I'm not saying that like um this is the way all people think. All I'm saying is that these are the patterns that the research show. The research consistently show that Americans notice those focal changes and Japanese folks notice those contextual changes. Even for the Japanese folks, right? Going on this American vacation caused their attention to the peripheral objects to go down. Going on the Japanese vacation increased American participants' perception on the contextual environment. So what we're learning here is that like half the story is true. The Japanese environment causes people to think in a way that's more consistent with the way the average Japanese person, most was a little extreme, the average Japanese person processes information, likely due to living in a culture that has complex environments, is what they're arguing here. So, like before we get to the discussion, which I normally don't read, but I'll do it for you all, we have another case. But this case is I call it the built environment, the environment that humans build. The sidewalks. Taking a stroll on your vacation is going to impact the way you process basic information. If you're in an environment where stuff's spread out, your brain, body, mind complex adapts so that you can survive in this complicated world, so that you can find how things are formed, patterned, and related. So this fits right in with what we were reading about last time. The present research examined a dynamic way in which cognition may be shaped and maintained by culture and found evidence that culturally specific patterns of attention may be at least partially afforded by the perceptual environment. Afforded means created, constructed, developed by. Study 1 demonstrated that Japanese scenes are more complex and ambiguous than American scenes, suggesting that objects look more embedded in the field in the Japanese perceptual environments. Study 2 further demonstrated that such cultural differences in the perceptual environment can actually lead to different patterns of attention. Both Japanese and Americans who were primed with Japanese scenes attended more to the contextual information than participants primed with American scenes. At the same time, we also found that there were within cultural variations as well as between cultural variations in the perceptual environment. The perceptual environment in New York City was judged to be more complex and ambiguous than the perceptual environment in smaller cities in the United States. It's possible that people living in New York City attend more to contextual information and thus are more holistic in their cognitive style than people who live in smaller US cities. But let's take a moment there. The way you think is embedded in the city you're in, not your mind. Your mind responds to it, but we consistently respond to these exposures, probably through our survival desire. However, such perceptual affordances may be overridden by other sociocultural mediated processes, such as interpersonal relationships, based on independent conceptions of self. They're saying we might be right, but we might be wrong because maybe this environmental patterning is based on an individualistic sort of sense of being. The present research suggests a dynamic process through which attention can be shaped and sustained by the perceptual environment. The environment you walk into controls how you think. The environment you walk into controls how you think. Given the fact that such perceptual environments have been historically constructed and maintained by people repeatedly exposed to a culturally specific perceptual environment, we believe that the current exploration sheds light on possible processes of mutual constitution Mutual constitution, that's when culture creates people and people create culture of cognitive processes and socio-cultural environment. The environment is built in a way that you have to think in a certain way. Just seeing that environment and probably through survival instincts, you develop cognitive patterns that help you survive the environment. The present research provides no indication of why Japanese or Asians in general would prefer relatively complex environments and Americans or Westerns in general would prefer relatively simple ones. Might be a mistake, might be random, who knows? There is good reason to suspect, however, that the Japanese and US environments do not differ solely because of necessity or chance. When asked to draw scenes or take photographs, Japanese include more context and emphasize focal objects less than do Americans. Thus, differential aesthetic preferences for context may lie behind the construction of the different built environments in the two civilizations. What is considered pretty in the United States is not considered pretty in Japan and vice versa. Maybe these aesthetic preferences, right, exist as part of the culture, and we built our cultures around this. And then, as a result, by following the aesthetic of the culture, boom, right? We ended up with environments that make us think in ways the culture wants us to think. Thus, differential aesthetic preference for context may lie behind the construction of the different built environments in the two civilizations. Our art aesthetic is important. This is why people fight over it, right? The way we build a school, the way we build a city, the way we put up art, what we consider art, what we consider not art, right? Those preferences aren't just preferences, they're ways of getting people to think a certain way. And I think great philosophers have known this for a long time. If you make a society a certain way, you will create people a certain way. In this case, it's you have no idea that walking to an environment is changing the basic way you process information, but it is. And this may seem small to you. To me, it is huge. Because basic cognitive processes shouldn't be changeable. They're basic, they're foundational, right? If simply going on a vacation changes your basic cognitive processes, it opens up a whole new world for understanding culture, right? Cultural environments exist, you know, and they exist in a space that people and culture interact in. But for people, they walk into that space, they think they're not being affected, but all of a sudden they're changing. Switches are being turned on. They're looking in the background, they're looking in the foreground. The questions are, what else does this apply to? Right? What else? What real life events does this apply to, right? It likely applies to everybody who's coming back from study abroad and who's struggling a little bit, right? What's going on there is that your meaning system switched. You were in an environment, literally the built environment, that caused you to think a different way about the world. And now you're transitioning back to a different built environment that wants you to think in a different way about the world, and it makes your head hurt because you don't understand what's going on, but you just start to change, right? And you're starting to make sense of the world. You're starting to process things more holistically or analytically, but what else is going on, right? Do built environments make us appreciate wealth more, make us want to be something we're not? Do they for example, one of the things that freaks me out as a teacher is I'm expected to stand in front of the room and lecture at you like I am better than you, like I am more knowledgeable. I'm trying to create a class where we discuss, not anymore, but I was, and that's the built environment is literally fighting me. I have colleagues that lecture. They walk into a classroom, nobody questions their methods, nobody questions what they're doing because it's consistent with the environment. They're prepped to take orders from my colleagues, right? When I walk into a classroom and try to do something fun, we got to move around the chairs. We got to do all that stuff, right? Like that level of built environment is probably telling you, ooh, there's something wrong with what Dericky's doing. I hope that didn't stop. Okay, it didn't stop recording. It just screensaver came on, right? But like these are things that you notice when you walk around. What does the environment tell you? How is it designed? How is it affecting the way you think? If you look at just the way we design cities and streets, we should have things organized into sections by grids, and we should cram the most number of people in there, the most number of stores in there. We should make sure the signs are focally located so people can easily locate what they want, because we want no latency between their perception and their consumer purchasing. Here's what I'm going to argue. The American environment doesn't just afford analytical processing, it affords thoughts that promote capitalist behaviors. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that that's what our environment does. It promotes efficiency, it promotes work. I mean, right now we're still working. It wasn't even a question to close down our college, right? And I'm not saying it necessarily should have been. My wife's still working too. It's just everybody's working in isolation from home. It's quite interesting, right? But that's how our culture is designed. Our culture is designed in a way that while it's not true for everybody, a lot of us have internet access, a lot of us have computers at home, a lot of us have the ability to engage in this type of learning. I hope that that's not a barrier to any of my students, right? And our society has made it so it's less of a barrier for our students in the United States than it is for folks in other places. But these environments about orderliness, right? About less objects and more focalness. Most of the scenes they were looking at, a lot of them had businesses in them, right? A lot of this is about more efficient processes. And what are we learning now? The struggle in our country right now, from my opinion, political about COVID, is the struggle between what's more important, human life or monetary gain. And this is not a question where everybody shares the Regis perception. Everyone at Regis doesn't share this perception, but most do, right? There is literally ideological statements made by people in power that are stating that, well, a few people are going to die, but we can't let our economy collapse. Our economy is more important than the very life of the people inside of it. This brings me to one of my final points about culture, and my final point for today. We can enter society, it's built a certain way, and built, we can extend it out from just physical to other ways that it's built, it's designed. And we end up hurting ourselves to benefit the ideas and worldview and value of the culture. The language we use can make us think certain things or not have the ability to think certain things. The environments we walk into shape basic cognitive processes. And likely, it's not that extreme to suggest that these built environments cause more complex behavior. I wonder if being exposed to an American environment makes one more efficient at spending money, right? Since that's like our core value. Makes us maybe less empathetic towards the poor. I mean, Where does it stop? Where does it start? These are questions we don't know the answer to, but these are questions that we think about when we are exploring science. This isn't about getting the simple idea that being exposed to different environments impacts one's basic thoughts. This is important because this is one of the first studies that manipulated culture directly and showed that basic cognition can be changed by exposure. What about stuff that's more in line with worldview and value? I'm going to guess those are going to be even more likely to be changed.